The badge was cold when I set it on the table. That was the only thing I felt. Not fury, not shame. Cold metal against my palm, and then nothing in my hand at all. And then I was walking out of the Hall of Accord, while 312 alien delegates watched me go, and not one of them said a word. 60 years. 60 years of showing up. 60 years of my people translating languages that had no human equivalent, building relay stations in dead space where no other species would send their workers, mediating conflicts between civilizations that had been trying to end each other since before humans had learned to write. 60 years of arriving early and leaving late, and asking for nothing except one seat at the table where decisions were made. They said no. Again. 31 cycles. That is how many times the High Council of the Galactic Accord had received humanity's petition for equal standing. 31 times across 6 decades. The petition had been reviewed, debated, tabled, delayed, sent to committee, returned from committee, and ultimately rejected. The reasons changed slightly each time, which I suppose was their way of being creative. This cycle, the official language was that humanity had not yet demonstrated sufficient civilizational maturity. I had been awake for 31 hours preparing my presentation. I had documents, records, verified contribution logs going back to the founding of the Accord. I had testimony from 14 species whose homeworlds still existed because human engineers had quietly fixed the environmental disasters that were about to end them. I had everything. The Cathari delegate, a tall creature named Vos Arath whose species had held a permanent seat on the High Council for 200 years, laughed when I began my opening statement. Not a polite sound, not an involuntary one, a deliberate, open laugh. He leaned back in his elevated chair and looked at the ceiling, and made the sound of someone deeply entertained by something small and harmless. I did not stop speaking. I finished my sentence. I set my notes down. I picked up the small translation badge that identified me as humanity's representative to the Galactic Accord, the position I had held for 11 years, and I placed it on the table in front of me. I straightened my jacket. I looked at the ceiling above the main chamber, where the Accord's founding charter was etched in 60 languages, and I noticed, not for the first time but somehow more clearly than ever before, that none of them were human. Then I walked out. No shouting, no declaration, no final speech about how they would regret this. That was what they expected, I think. They had spent 60 years believing that humans were impulsive, emotional, reactive. They had watched our historical broadcasts, the ones we had submitted during our application to join the Accord, and they had found the moments of conflict and used those to define us entirely. They were waiting for me to confirm what they already believed. So I gave them silence instead. There is a moment in any long negotiation when you realize the other side has stopped listening, not because they are distracted or rude, though sometimes those things are true, but because they have already decided the outcome, and every word you speak from that point forward is simply noise they are waiting to end. I had recognized that moment many cycles ago, somewhere around the 17th petition. I had kept coming back anyway, because the work we were doing was real, and the relationship had value, and I believed, as every ambassador before me had believed, that persistence was a form of argument. Persistence is not a form of argument. I understood that now, standing in the corridor with my coat over my arm. Persistence in the wrong direction is just a longer version of the same mistake. What the Accord had needed, for a very long time, was not more human patience. It needed to feel the weight of our absence. I thought about Ambassador Lena Marsh, my predecessor, who had served for 14 years in this same role. She had told me, when I was first appointed, that the work was meaningful, even when the recognition was not. She had meant it genuinely. She was that kind of person. But I had watched her retire quietly to a house in the Scottish countryside after 14 years, and leave no official record in the Accord that named anything she had achieved, and I had thought then, and I thought now, that meaningful work deserved more than private satisfaction. The corridor outside the main chamber was long and pale, lit by the soft blue light that the Veloon preferred in all their public buildings. My footsteps were the only sound. I passed 2 Oran delegates going the other direction, both in their layered gray robes, both of them pretending not to look at me. The Oran Collective had abstained on humanity's petition. Again. They always abstained. Abstaining was their way of feeling neutral about something while still allowing it to happen without objection. I did not look at them either. My aide, a young man named Callum Ward who had been with me for 3 years and had the specific skill of knowing when not to speak, fell into step beside me about halfway down the corridor. He had been watching the session from the observation gallery. He handed me my coat without saying anything. Outside the building, Velun Prime's sky was the color of shallow water, pale green and translucent, the kind of sky that looked beautiful only because you knew it was alien. The air was cool and smelled faintly of something mineral, the way all atmospheres smell when you have been breathing filtered recycled air for too long, and suddenly you are outside and breathing something real. I stood at the top of the wide stone steps that led down to the diplomatic quarter, and I breathed it in, and I looked at that strange pale sky, and I made a decision that had been building in me, in all of us, for a very long time. I did not make it out of anger. That is important. Anger passes. Anger makes you loud and then it makes you quiet, and then you go back and apologize, and everything continues exactly as it was. What I felt was something quieter than anger, and far more durable. It was clarity. I had spent 11 years as humanity's voice in a room that did not want to hear us. Before me, Ambassador Lena Marsh had spent 14 years in the same role. Before her, Director Paul Okafor had spent 9. We had all carried the same badge, the same title, the same careful optimism into the same chamber, and we had all watched the same vote go the same way. And we had all returned home to brief our governments and prepare for the next cycle, because that was what you did when you believed that patience was a form of commitment. I called Director General Adaeze Nwosu from the transit pod on the way back to the human consulate. She was in Lagos, and it was early morning there, and she picked up on the second signal because she had been waiting for my call. I told her the vote. She already knew from the live feed, but she let me say it. Then I said, "It is time." She was quiet for a moment, not the hesitating kind of quiet, the kind that belongs to someone choosing their words carefully, because the words are going to matter for a very long time after they are spoken. "Come home, Sarah," she said. That was all. 2 words, but they carried everything that needed to be said, and I understood them completely. And when the pod reached the consulate, I went directly to my private office and began the process of drafting the withdrawal notification that the Global Senate had prepared 18 months ago and quietly kept in a sealed file, waiting for this exact moment. The notification was not a declaration. It did not say we were leaving. It did not threaten or accuse or demand. It was a simple administrative document stating that, due to an internal review of resource allocation, the Earth Cooperative would be conducting a restructuring of its external commitments over the following 180 days. All contracts, personnel assignments, and infrastructure agreements would be evaluated on a case-by-case basis. In plain terms, we were going to disappear. Quietly, methodically, completely. And we were not going to explain why, until they understood it on their own terms. I signed the document. I sent it to the Accord's administrative office, where it would be logged, filed, and forgotten among the thousands of bureaucratic documents that passed through that office every week. Nobody would read it carefully. Nobody would think to check what it actually meant in practice. That was something else they had never properly understood about humans. We are patient when we have a reason to be. And we had been patient for 60 years. We were very, very good at it by now. Callum knocked on the office door about an hour later. He came in and sat across from me and looked at the signed document on the desk without making any comment about what it represented. "Did you tell them?" he asked. "We filed a notice," I said. He nodded slowly. He was 26 years old, and he was already better at reading between lines than most diplomats twice his age. "Are we going home?" "We are going home," I said. He looked out the window at the pale green Veluan sky for a moment, then looked back at me. He did not ask anything else. He just nodded once more and stood up and began making arrangements with the quiet efficiency that had made him indispensable. I stayed in my chair after he left. I pulled up a blank log entry on my personal record, the private journal I had kept throughout every year of my service, and I typed 4 sentences. They never asked us what we were carrying. They never counted the weight. They built their peace on our hands and called it their achievement. They are about to find out how heavy it was. I saved the entry. I closed the file. But first I did something I had not done in 11 years on that post. I walked back through the consulate to the small room near the entrance that served as our cultural display, a modest space with photographs of Earth that we had put there for Accord visitors who might be curious. Images of cities and coastlines and winter mountains and children running across a field at golden hour. The room was rarely visited. Most officials passed the door without looking in. I stood in that room for a few minutes. I thought about what those photographs represented. Not nostalgia, not sentiment. 60 years of human service to the Accord, and this was the visible record of it. A small room near the entrance that nobody came into. A display that nobody read. I turned off the light in that room. I went to pack my things. In the transit bay the next morning, I looked back at the Hall of Accord one last time. Its towers were old and beautiful, carved by the Veloun from stone that had been standing since before humans had fire. The founding charter caught the early light along the upper walls. I turned away and walked to the ship. Behind me, the Hall of Accord stood exactly as it always had, silent and enormous, and absolutely certain of its own permanence. It did not know yet that permanence is not a thing you inherit, it is a thing you maintain, and the people who had been maintaining it had just decided to stop. The ship lifted. Veloun Prime fell away below us, pale and green and entirely unaware. I opened my log and added one more line. They will. 140 kilometers above the surface of Veloun Prime, in a small observation room aboard a standard diplomatic transport, I sat by the port window and watched the planet shrink to a green point of light, and then disappear entirely into the dark between stars. The ship was quiet around me. Most of the staff were sleeping, or trying to. Callum had brought coffee at some point, and I had drunk half of it and let the rest go cold. I did not feel like sleeping. I felt like thinking, which for me is rarely restful, but almost always useful. I was not thinking about the vote, or about Vos Arath's laugh, or about any of the events of the past 31 cycles. I was thinking about a water purification station on a moon called Kethis 4 that I had personally negotiated the construction of 11 years ago, in my first month on the job, when I had still believed that demonstrating value was a path to recognition. The Cathari had a settlement on Kethis 4, about 40,000 people, mostly young families posted there as part of a resource development program. The moon had water, but it was chemically complex, not dangerous exactly, but requiring a level of filtration that the Cathari's own available technology could not reliably provide at that scale. I had arranged for 3 human engineering teams to travel out and build the system, train local technicians, set up a remote monitoring contract that renewed automatically every 5 years. That contract was one of 712 similar agreements that human technical teams maintained across Accord space. Each one had a renewal clause. Each renewal clause, in the new administrative framework we had quietly constructed over the past 18 months of planning, would now route through a human approval office that would, over the coming 180 days, systematically decline to renew. Nobody in the Accord knew this yet. Nobody had thought to look. Why would they? The contracts had been renewing themselves for decades. It had never occurred to anyone to ask who was approving them, because it had never occurred to anyone that the answer might one day change. The ship crossed into jump distance, and the stars shifted, and the whole of Accord space fell away behind us. When we came out near Earth 4 days later, the planet looked exactly as it always did from orbit, blue and white and vast with quiet life, and I felt something loosen in my chest that I had not known was tight. 11 years is a long time to spend somewhere that is not home. You stop noticing the absence, and then suddenly the presence hits you all at once, and you realize you have been holding yourself at a slight tension for years without being aware of it, and then you stop, and your whole body understands the difference. Director General Nwosu met me in person at the Cape Town landing facility. She was a small woman with close-cut gray hair and a handshake that felt like a statement about who she was and what she expected of the world. We had worked together for 9 years across thousands of light years of communication delay, and this was only the 4th time I had seen her face to face. She walked with me to a private meeting room and closed the door, and we sat across from each other in plain chairs, with no diplomats, no aides, no recording equipment, and she looked at me steadily for a moment. "How do you feel?" she asked. "Ready," I said. She nodded, and in her nod was the understanding of someone who had been waiting for this word for a very long time. The Senate voted this morning. Unanimous. The withdrawal protocol is fully authorized. We begin coordinated drawdown in 48 hours. I had known this was coming. I had been part of the team that designed the drawdown framework over the past 2 years, had spent many long evenings helping map every human contribution to Accord infrastructure, cataloging what we did and where we did it and how often, so that we could calculate the precise sequence and timing of our departure for maximum clarity, not maximum harm. That was a distinction I had argued for repeatedly in the planning meetings, and I was glad it had held through all the political pressure to make it sharper and faster and louder. We were not trying to cause harm. We were trying to be seen. Those are different things, even when they can look similar from the outside. What is the first phase? I asked, though I already knew every detail by heart. Communications, she said. We pull our routing technicians and let the relay degradation happen naturally. It will take about 3 weeks before anyone notices meaningful signal delays. By then, Phase 2 is already in motion. Phase 2 was logistics. Human cargo pilots, supply chain coordinators, and port management teams who worked under dozens of subsidiary company names across the Accord's major transit hubs. They would resign their positions, retire early, transfer to internal Earth assignments, or simply not show up on the day their contracts quietly lapsed. The companies were real, legally registered, with genuine contracts. Those contracts would not be violated. They would simply be allowed to expire, the way any business allows a contract to expire when it decides not to renew. Phase 3 was medical support. Phase 4 was engineering maintenance. Phase 5 was the diplomatic withdrawal, which had already been underway in slow motion since the moment I had set the translation badge on the table in the Hall of Accord. We had stopped sending representatives to the 37 subsidiary Accord committees that humans had quietly dominated for decades. No announcement, no resignation letters. We simply stopped attending, and the empty chairs began to accumulate, and nobody had yet realized that all the empty chairs belonged to the same species. How long before they connect the pattern? I asked. Director General Nwosu smiled, and it was a tired smile, but also something else underneath the tiredness, something that had the shape of 40 years of patience finally becoming movement. Our analysts estimate 60 to 90 days before the first serious alarm reaches the High Council. The individual problems will surface earlier, but they will be attributed to other causes: equipment failure, cosmic interference, market fluctuation. And when they finally understand what is actually happening, then we see what they are made of, she said simply. I thought about Vosserath laughing at the ceiling, and I felt nothing specifically about him. No desire to see him fail or feel small. I simply wanted him to understand, and everyone around him to understand, in the only language that had ever seemed to reach them clearly, which was consequence. The next 6 weeks were the strangest of my career. I was home, but I was not resting. The withdrawal was the most complex logistical operation Earth had ever conducted, more intricate in its coordination than any of the enormous infrastructure projects we had built for the Accord over 6 decades. Because this one required absolute precision without any external visibility. We could not afford a single premature leak, because the moment the Accord understood what was happening, they would move to freeze contracts, block departures, issue official complaints, and the whole careful architecture of the withdrawal would become a confrontation, which was exactly what we had decided not to do. We wanted them to experience the absence, not be warned about it. There is a difference between telling someone what they depend on and letting them discover it. I spent those weeks reviewing departure reports that came in by the hundreds, tracking personnel rotations across 14 star systems, monitoring the relay network degradation data that our sensor teams transmitted from across Accord space through channels that the Accord did not know we were using. I slept 4 or 5 hours a night and ate at my desk more often than not, and drank too much coffee and felt, strangely, more alive than I had felt in years. There is something about working toward a thing you fully believe in that makes the difficult parts feel purposeful rather than exhausting. On day 47, the first real crack appeared. It came as a signal from our monitoring station near the Valoon Rim, one of the small observation posts we had maintained in the outer systems for years under the cover of navigational survey work. The operator, a young woman named Harriet Cole, sent me a clipped transmission with 3 attached data feeds and a message that read, Relay grid sector 9 is down. Checking propagation. I opened the data feeds immediately. The Accord's primary warp relay network, which enabled fast communication and passenger transport across all 11 core systems, ran through a series of booster nodes that required regular manual recalibration. That recalibration had been performed, without a single interruption, by human technicians working for a consortium of independent contractors for the past 38 years. The last human team had departed Node Cluster 9, 16 days ago. The automated systems were still running, but automated systems on these particular nodes needed human oversight to catch the small, cascading calibration errors that built up gradually over time. Left unchecked, those errors compounded. The errors had been compounding for 16 days. Sector 9 went from full operating capacity to 40% functionality in the span of 6 hours. Signal delays across 3 star systems jumped from seconds to hours. Passenger transit had to reroute, then reroute again. A Mirathi cargo liner attempted a jump calculation based on degraded relay data and came out of transit 2 astronomical units from its intended target, undamaged but completely stranded, broadcasting a distress signal that took 11 hours to reach the nearest station because the relay node handling that frequency was also beginning to degrade. I watched all of this happen in real time on my monitoring screens, the data updating every few minutes from Harriet's post. The Accord's technical office issued a public statement calling it a localized infrastructure anomaly and promising a full investigation. The investigation would not find what they were looking for, because they would be looking for a malfunction. There was no malfunction. Every system was working exactly as designed. It was simply no longer being tended by the people who had always tended it. On day 63, the Kareth Duvani situation escalated. I had been watching that particular fault line closely for weeks, because it was the most politically volatile of all the places where human withdrawal would create friction. The Kareth and the Duvani had a territorial dispute going back over 2 centuries, a long, slow-burning argument over competing claims to a cluster of resource-rich moons in the outer systems. For 60 years, that dispute had been kept below the threshold of open conflict through a series of informal mediation channels that were almost entirely human-operated and almost entirely unacknowledged in any official Accord record. The reason they were unacknowledged was simple. Officially recognizing the dispute would require the High Council to take a formal position. The High Council had never been able to agree on a position, so instead, the dispute had been managed quietly, kept from igniting through the patient, invisible work of human mediators, who spent their careers making careful communications and arranging quiet agreements that carried no official stamp but kept 2 species from going to war. Those mediators had been gone for 33 days. The Kareth sent 3 patrol ships into a disputed moon's orbital space. The Duvani scrambled their own response. There were no exchanges of fire, but both sides issued public statements in language that made Harriet Cole send me a second message reading simply, "This is going to get loud." She was right. Within a week, both governments had formally requested Accord intervention. The High Council convened an emergency session. For the first time in 6 decades, the dispute was on the official record, which meant the High Council had to take a position, which meant 6 days of procedural deadlock, 3 formal walkouts, and no resolution reached. I watched the session logs in my flat in Nairobi and thought about all the small, invisible, completely unacknowledged work that had kept this specific crisis from reaching this specific room for 6 decades. The names of every mediator who had ever worked that border channel ran through my head. None of those names were anywhere in the Accord's official historical record. On day 71, Mirel Station reported critical supply shortages. Mirel was one of the largest cargo redistribution hubs in the Inner Accord, handling supply routing for 9 systems. Its logistics management software had been built and maintained by a human company called Orbital Flow Solutions, under contract for 22 years. Orbital Flow had quietly wound down its Accord operations as part of Phase 4 of the withdrawal. The software still ran, but the people who knew how to modify it when cargo patterns shifted unexpectedly, who understood the quirks of its load balancing protocols, who had built the manual override procedures for emergency scenarios, were no longer reachable. The station's own technical staff were competent. They tried to adapt. But the system was complex in specific ways that had never been written into external documentation, because for 22 years there had never been a need to document those specifics externally, because the people who understood them were always present. 3 docking bays backed up. Cargo accumulated in queues the software was misrouting. Perishable goods sat in transit holds waiting for clearances that the system was slow processing. Food prices in 2 nearby systems began to rise. The Accord's Economic Council issued a report attributing it to seasonal demand fluctuation. On day 83, the message I had been expecting arrived. It came through an unofficial channel, encrypted in a format I recognized because we had developed it together years ago for sensitive back-channel communications. The sender was Ambassador Thuran of the Orin Collective. Thuran was one of the few Accord officials I had genuinely respected throughout my years of service. The Orin were careful, measured people who valued stability above nearly all other things, which was why they abstained on contentious votes. But Thuran was sharper than his public conduct suggested, and I had sat across from him in enough private settings to know that he understood considerably more than he said in formal chambers. His message contained 4 sentences. Ambassador Voss, I hope this reaches you well. We are observing some unusual patterns in several areas of Accord infrastructure, and I wonder if Earth is perhaps experiencing some internal difficulty that has affected your external operations. If there is anything the Orin Collective can offer in terms of support, I am available to speak at your convenience. I read it 3 times. Then I did not reply. Not because I had no respect for Thuran. He deserved more courtesy than most. But replying at that moment would have framed what was happening as a problem we needed help solving. And it was not a problem. It was a demonstration. A lesson interrupted before it reaches its conclusion is not a lesson. It is just a moment of discomfort with no lasting meaning. I filed the message under received and returned to my work. On day 91, Callum knocked on my door before breakfast and came in and sat down without being invited, which he only did when the news was significant enough that courtesy felt beside the point. He put his tablet on the table. The screen showed a live recording from a traffic camera near the Accord's main administrative complex orbital station, where a cargo ship had been coming in on automated approach. The ship's approach system had routed it through a traffic management protocol that, as of 47 days earlier, no longer had a human controller managing the central coordination node. The ship's hull clipped the docking ring. One of the docking arm extensions sheared off cleanly and tumbled slowly in the low-gravity orbital environment, spinning in a long, lazy arc before a maintenance pod collected it. Nobody was hurt. The ship sustained a 6-meter scrape along its lower hull, but the footage was clear and unambiguous, captured on multiple cameras, and it was already moving across every news feed in the Accord. I sat and watched the recording for a while. I thought about Stuart Adeyemi, who had managed traffic at that exact node for 9 years and who was currently sitting at a desk in the Kenyan Space Agency offices in Mombasa on paid administrative leave, waiting to see what the next months would bring. By his own count, Stuart had guided over 40,000 successful dockings without a single incident in his 9 years at that node. I thought about what 40,000 successful dockings looked like in the Accord's official record. It looked like nothing, because nothing going wrong was indistinguishable, from the outside, from nobody being there at all. Until now. What else? I said to Callum. He picked up the tablet. He read me the morning summary. 3 more relay nodes showing significant degradation. A medical supply shipment delayed 8 days due to the Mirel logistics backlog, affecting a Sethan clinic that served about 12,000 people. The Kareth Duvani talks had stalled again without a human mediator in the room. A research station in the outer systems had missed 2 scheduled communications from Earth-based teams and was operating on emergency protocols. When Callum finished reading, I picked up my coffee, which had gone cold, and I drank it anyway. I wrote 6 words in my log. They are starting to feel the weight. I looked out at Nairobi in the morning. The city was loud and alive and full of people going about their day. The air still smelled like the rain that had passed through before dawn. Everything here was exactly as it had always been, exactly as it was supposed to be. Across the galaxy, 60 years of invisible maintenance was coming undone, slowly and precisely and completely, and the Accord had not yet found the right words for what was happening to them, because they had never needed words for it before. They had assumed it would always simply be there. I got up, poured a fresh coffee, and went back to work. On day 104, the Sethin homeworld declared a planetary health emergency. I was eating breakfast when the notification came through, and I set down my fork and read it twice, and then I sat very still for a while with the feeling that certain news produces when it is both surprising and entirely predictable at the same time. You see it coming from a distance, but you still feel the impact. The Sethin were a quiet species, communal and unhurried, with a biology that made them notably vulnerable to a particular category of respiratory pathogen that was rare across the galaxy, but not entirely unknown. They had experienced minor outbreaks before, managed without too much difficulty. The Accord had a response protocol for exactly this scenario, a clear, structured framework for rapid deployment of medical coordination teams, supply routing, and containment modeling that guided quarantine decisions and treatment priorities. The containment software at the center of that protocol had been developed over 18 years by a human medical informatics team based in Edinburgh. It ran on every major Accord medical station and had been updated continuously by a group of 12 people who were now, as of 49 days ago, no longer under Accord contract. The software still ran, it was still taking in data and producing projections, but a new variant of the pathogen had emerged with a slightly different transmission profile, and the software needed its modeling parameters adjusted to correctly account for the difference. That adjustment required someone who understood the underlying codebase at a level of detail that only the Edinburgh team possessed. The Accord's medical office sent 3 urgent requests to Orbital Health Systems, the contractor responsible. The first 2 went unanswered. The third received an automated response explaining that Orbital Health Systems had suspended its Accord-facing operations pending an internal restructuring review, and that all service inquiries should be directed to a contact address that also turned out to be unmanned. I had not planned for the Sethin outbreak. We could not have planned for it, because we had no way to predict when a new pathogen variant would emerge on a specific world. It was a coincidence of timing, which made it simultaneously more troubling and more honest than anything we had engineered deliberately. The relay failures, the logistics breakdowns, the diplomatic gaps, those were chosen. This was the galaxy simply being what it was, and the absence of human expertise making it worse. That distinction mattered to me. I spent 48 hours sitting with it. I had a direct line to a physician named Oliver Grant, the lead developer of the containment software, and one of the 12 people who had been withdrawn from Accord service. I could call him and ask him to provide technical assistance on purely humanitarian grounds, completely separate from any political question. He would have agreed without hesitation. Oliver was the kind of person who had spent 18 years building tools to protect people he had never personally met, and would never ask anything in return. I did not call him, not yet. The reason required me to be honest with myself in a way that was uncomfortable. If I called Oliver, and he quietly fixed the software, and the outbreak was contained, and everything returned to normal, the Accord's medical records would show a managed incident, and the crisis would be filed away, and within 6 months, it would be as if it had never happened, and the same pattern that had governed the past 60 years would continue. Humans solve the problem. Humans receive no acknowledgement. Humans attend the next vote, and are told to wait another cycle. The lesson would dissolve back into the air, like rain into dry ground. Nothing would have changed. The lesson had to be allowed to run long enough to be felt, not just noticed. I called Director General Nwosu instead. "The Sethin outbreak," I said, when she answered. "I know," she said. She sounded tired, the particular tiredness of someone who had been watching a situation develop from a distance, and carrying it with them for days. "I have been following it since the emergency declaration." "We need to decide," I said. "We do," she said, "and I need you to tell me honestly, Sarah, is the lesson worth it? Is what we are trying to make them understand worth what is happening on Seth right now?" I did not answer immediately. She had asked me to be honest, and honesty required me to sit with the question rather than reach for a quick answer that would let me off the weight of it. "I think 60 more years of the same arrangement costs more than this outbreak," I said finally. "I think 6 more decades of our people spending their lives maintaining a system that refuses to give them a genuine voice. That is a cost measured in human lives, and human possibilities, and human generations, that will never get to be something other than invisible. I believe that the lesson, if it is truly learned, prevents something much larger from continuing. I paused. But I am sitting here well-fed and safe in Nairobi, while people on Seth are sick, and the software that could help them is not being updated because of a decision I helped design. And both of those things are true at the same time, and I am not comfortable with that. Nwosu was quiet for a long moment. We give it 2 more weeks. If containment fails beyond recovery in that window, we intervene directly. Full assistance. No conditions. No announcement. But we do not signal our availability to the Accord before then. Agreed, I said. And in 2 weeks, she continued, we reach out regardless of the outbreak status. The point has been made, Sarah. Multiple points. They need to hear from us before the lesson becomes permanent structural damage that takes years to repair rather than months. I agreed with that completely. I had been running the numbers myself, and the data suggested we were approaching a threshold where some of what was deteriorating would require more than maintenance to restore. Infrastructure left untended long enough needs reconstruction, not repair. And reconstruction is measured in years and resources that neither we nor the Accord could afford to spend on things that should never have been allowed to break. I spent the next week watching the Sethan situation with an intensity that made it difficult to sleep. The local medical teams were doing everything they could. They were good, disciplined, knowledgeable people, but they were working with a modeling system that was giving them slightly wrong projections, and in an outbreak, slightly wrong projections lead to slightly wrong resource allocations, and slightly wrong resource allocations compound into outcomes that are significantly worse than they needed to be. I watched the mortality numbers tick upward by increments that felt unbearably small, and were adding up to something that was not small at all. On day 112, I called Callum into my office and told him to begin preparing a formal communication to the Accord's High Council. Not sending it yet, preparing it. I wanted the language exact. He came back 2 hours later with a draft. I read it. I changed 6 words. Then I sat back and looked at it for a while. The communication would be brief. It would acknowledge that the Earth Cooperative was aware of the operational difficulties the Accord had experienced over the recent period. It would note that the Earth Cooperative was available to discuss these matters, and would welcome an Accord delegation to Earth at a time of the delegation's choosing. It would include a list of items the Earth Cooperative would wish to address in such discussions. The list would be specific and detailed and very long. But I did not send it yet. On day 120, I was in my flat watching the Accord's emergency broadcast channel when the transmission I had not been expecting appeared. The speaker was not a standard Accord communications official. It was the Cathari Grand Speaker herself, a position of such formal weight that its direct engagement with Accord public communications had not occurred in living memory. Her name was Voss Kareth. She was older than I had expected from the images I had seen in official records, and she stood before the Cathari seal with the stillness of someone who had prepared every word and every gesture and every pause. She spoke about the current state of Accord infrastructure, in terms that were measured and deliberately calm, which itself communicated the seriousness of what she was describing to anyone who understood Cathari formal registers. She spoke about the transit disruptions and the supply shortages, and the situation on the Sethan homeworld, and the border tensions in the outer systems. She spoke about the importance of stability and the obligations of member species to one another. And then she said that the Cathari government had conducted an internal review of infrastructure dependencies across the Accord, and had identified a consistent pattern: the critical systems that were currently failing, across multiple domains and multiple regions of Accord space, appeared to rely on contractors and personnel affiliated with the Earth Cooperative. She said the Cathari were deeply concerned by the apparent reduction in Earth Cooperative involvement, and were formally requesting an emergency convening of the High Council to address what she called, precisely and without drama, a matter of galactic stability. I set down my coffee. Not because the content was surprising. I had expected this moment to arrive, had prepared for it, had spent months thinking about what would happen when the pattern finally became visible to someone at the level of the Cathari Grand Speaker. I set it down because hearing it said out loud, in that formal voice, on that broadcast, made it fully real in a way that monitoring reports and data feeds had not quite managed. They had finally looked at the shape of what had happened to them, and the shape had a name. I called Callum immediately. Start preparing the full reception framework, I said. They are coming to us. How long? He asked. Less than a week, I said. It was 5 days. On day 125, a formal communication arrived from the Accord's High Council, addressed to Director General Nwosu and copied to 17 senior Accord officials. The communication requested that a senior Earth Cooperative representative make themselves available for emergency consultations at the earliest possible opportunity. The language was formal and careful, and almost but not quite avoided sounding like a request from someone who understood they had no leverage but was trying not to say so directly. Nwosu forwarded it to me with a single line, "Your call on timing." I thought about Theron's unanswered message, still sitting in my files. I thought about 32 cycles of rejected petitions, each one handled by someone who believed that the next cycle might be different. I thought about Stuart in Mombasa, and Harriet at her observation post, and Oliver in Edinburgh, and every person who had given years of their life to work that was never formally recognized as theirs. I replied to the High Council's communication after 22 days. The wait was not arbitrary. 22 days was the precise amount of time the Accord had taken, in the most recent cycle, to schedule a response to humanity's petition for equal standing after it had been formally submitted. I had the date in my records. I had always kept very careful records. That was another thing they had never quite understood about us. My reply was professional and completely without hostility. I informed the High Council that Director General Nwosu would be pleased to receive an Accord delegation at the Earth Cooperative's primary facility in Cape Town at a mutually convenient time, that I would be serving as lead negotiator, and that I had attached a preliminary list of items that the Earth Cooperative would expect the delegation to be prepared to engage substantively on arrival. The list had 17 points. The first was formal recognition of human contributions to Accord infrastructure and governance. The second was permanent representation on the High Council. The remaining 15 were detailed and specific, and told anyone reading carefully that these were not opening positions designed to be bargained down. They were the minimum acceptable terms for an agreement. The delegation confirmed their arrival within 6 hours of receiving my reply. 17 ships, the largest diplomatic envoy the Accord had assembled for a bilateral meeting in the history of the organization. On day 114, the High Council's emergency session formally acknowledged, for the first time in Accord history, that the organization was experiencing what their official record called a coordinated infrastructure reduction event. The language was careful and indirect, as official language tends to be when the people producing it are not fully ready to say what they mean. But the meaning was clear enough. The Accord was admitting, in institutional terms, that something was wrong, and that the wrongness had a shape, and that the shape was human. I read the session summary 4 times, and then I called Callum in and read him the relevant section and watched his face process it. "They still are not saying it was us specifically," he said. "No," I said, "but they are saying it was coordinated, and they are saying it was across infrastructure domains, and they are saying it began in the same 90-day window." I paused. Theron knows. The Grand Speaker knows. In another 10 days, enough people will know that the ones who do not know will begin to seem like they are choosing not to. Callum nodded. "And then they come to us. And then they come to us," I said. On day 122, 3 days after the Grand Speaker's broadcast, I called a meeting with the 3 senior advisors who had been part of the withdrawal planning team from the beginning. We sat in my flat in Nairobi with the windows open to the evening air, and we went through the full status of every phase of the withdrawal together. The relay network had degraded to 61% of operational capacity in the affected sectors. Repair without human involvement was technically possible, but would take the Accord's own engineering teams an estimated 14 months. With human teams, it would take 6 weeks. The Kareth-Duvani border situation had settled into a fragile holding pattern that the High Council's emergency session had managed to stabilize, barely, through a combination of formal warnings and an expedited resource-sharing proposal that had taken 6 days to negotiate, and that every human mediator in the room would have achieved in an afternoon. The proposal held for now. The Sethan outbreak had been contained at manageable levels but had not yet been resolved. Oliver was ready to travel the moment I called him. Miral Station had worked through the worst of its logistics failure by redistributing cargo manually, which had cost 3 times the usual labor and twice the usual time, and had resulted in a level of sustained disruption across 9 systems that the Accord's Economic Council was still struggling to fully quantify. The total picture was exactly what we had calculated it would be, which was itself a kind of evidence. We had not done this carelessly. We had mapped it, measured it, understood it, as well as any of us could understand something that had never been done before. The Accord was not broken. It was strained, in specific and legible ways, in the exact places where human involvement had been withdrawn, and not in the places where it had not. The pattern was clear to anyone who looked at it with honest eyes. "Are we ready to receive them?" one of my advisors asked. Her name was Nina Hartley, and she had spent 9 years working in Accord logistical coordination before being brought onto the withdrawal planning team, and she understood the mechanical reality of what we had done better than almost anyone. "We have been ready since day 1, I said. That was always the plan. The question was whether they would be ready to hear us. "Do you think they are?" she asked. I thought about the Grand Speaker's broadcast. I thought about the specific language she had used, a matter of galactic stability, and what it cost a Cathari of that formal standing to frame it that way, rather than as an internal Accord administrative matter. "I think they are closer to ready than they have ever been," I said. "I think 31 cycles of rejection got us to this point, and I think that is a significant cost, and I think what we build from here needs to be worth that cost." I paused. "I believe it will be." Nina Hartley nodded once. "Then let's receive them well." I stood at my office window and looked at the lights of Nairobi spreading out below me, and thought about a pale green sky, and a long pale corridor, and a cold metal badge, and the specific silence of a room full of people who had made a choice not to speak. I thought about all of it, and then I went to prepare. The morning the Accord delegation arrived in Earth orbit, I was not at the landing facility. I was in my flat, making tea, reading through a summary report from Harriet Cole at the Veluan Rim observation post, and watching the rain move across the city outside my window, in the slow, unhurried way that Nairobi rain had in that particular season. This was intentional. Callum had suggested I be present for the orbital arrival as a gesture of hospitality, the kind of diplomatic signaling that communicated welcome and reduced the formality of the initial approach. I had told him no, and I had told him why, and he had nodded and not argued. The delegation needed to spend some time in orbit above Earth, looking down at the planet, without anyone from our side rushing to receive them. Let them look. Let them sit in their ships and see a world they had treated as a junior member of their organization for 6 decades, and understand, in whatever way each of them was capable of understanding, that they had come to us this time. That was not theater. It was honesty. The relationship was being restructured, and restructuring requires clarity about where things actually stand before you can build something new on an honest foundation. The 17 ships had been in orbit for 9 hours before I sent the formal invitation to land. 18 months before this moment, I would not have been capable of that 9-hour wait. Not because I lacked patience, but because I had spent 11 years in a system that rewarded human eagerness to accommodate and punished human stillness. When you spend enough time in a context that treats your urgency as eagerness to serve, you internalize a pressure to keep moving, to keep filling silences, to keep demonstrating your value through action. That pressure had taken me months to fully recognize in myself, and more months after that to let go of. The lead ship touched down at the Cape Town facility at just past noon. The southern hemisphere autumn had held clear and cool, the sky a specific blue that belongs to that part of the world and no other. I was in the main facility's preparation room when the landing was confirmed, sitting across from Callum and 2 senior advisors from the Global Senate's External Relations Office, reviewing the negotiation framework one final time. I had slept 8 hours the night before, which had not happened in months. I had eaten a full breakfast. I had dressed carefully and without hurry. These were small things, but they mattered, because a negotiation in which one side arrives exhausted and the other arrives rested is already tilted before a word is spoken. Ambassador Theron led the delegation across the landing pad. He was older than I remembered from our occasional in-person meetings on Veloon Prime. The Oran's distinctive coloring deepened into more complex tones, his movements slightly more deliberate. He walked toward me with the measured step of someone who had spent several days preparing very carefully for a moment that was not going to be what he was used to. When he reached me, he stopped. He bowed his head, not deeply, but genuinely. "Ambassador Voss, thank you for receiving us." "Welcome to Earth," I said. "Please come in." The meeting room we had chosen was large and circular, with high windows looking across the bay to where the ocean caught the afternoon light. The room was clean and comfortable, without being formal in the way that rooms designed to impress tend to be cold. We had not tried to impress. We had tried to be ourselves, which was a choice that itself communicated something. There were 17 chairs on the delegation side of the table, and 3 on ours, mine, Callum's, and Director General Nwosu's chair, which was present but empty, because Nwosu would be joining by secure link from Lagos for the formal portions of the session. We had deliberately not filled our side. We did not need to appear larger than we were. We were exactly the right size, and we knew it now in a way we had not always been given room to know. I recognized most of the delegates as they seated themselves. The Cathari representative was Voss Marine, a senior advisor to the Grand Speaker, younger than most in the room, and carrying herself with a particular alertness, as if she had been given a specific instruction to pay attention to everything. Beside her sat the Mirathi representative and 2 Orin delegates in addition to Theron, and the Sethan health official whose homeworld was still in the middle of an active outbreak, and a dozen others across the full range of Accord species whose interests had brought them here. I looked at each of them, slowly and without apology, the way you look at people when you want them to know they have your full attention, and that your attention is not rushed. "I want to begin," I said, "by telling you why I did not reply to your communication for 22 days. The room was very still. 22 days was exactly how long it took the High Council to schedule a formal response to humanity's most recent petition for equal standing, after that petition was submitted. I have the date in my records." I paused and let that settle. I keep very careful records. We all do, across our entire history of service to the Accord. That is a habit we have because the official records have generally not kept them for us. Voss Marine looked at the table. Theron's expression did not change, but the quality of his attention shifted in a way I had learned to read across years of meetings. "I am not saying this to be unkind," I continued. "I am saying it because I want us to begin from an honest foundation. You are here because the Accord is in crisis. Several simultaneous crises, in fact, across infrastructure, logistics, medicine, and diplomatic stability. And you have correctly identified that the source of these crises is the systematic reduction in human involvement in systems that you did not know, until now, that humans were operating." I opened the folder in front of me. The document inside was called The Ledger. "This is a record of what you did not see. It covers 60 years. It has been independently verified by 3 external audit teams. It is not an argument. It is not a demand. It is a factual account of what human personnel, human expertise, and human labor have contributed to the functioning of the Galactic Accord since the day our membership began." I looked around the room. I would ask that each of you take the time to read it carefully before we enter substantive discussions, because everything we talk about in the days ahead will be grounded in what this document contains. Copies were distributed. The room went quiet with the particular quality of people reading something that is requiring them to recalibrate. I watched their faces as they read. The Sethan health official reached page 11, and something shifted in his expression that I did not have an exact word for. Page 11 covered human contributions to Accord medical infrastructure, including the development and maintenance history of the containment software that was currently operating below capacity on his homeworld. Theron read methodically, as the Orin always processed information, his face composed, his left hand gradually curling inward on the table as the pages accumulated. Voss Marine stopped on page 7. She looked up at me with an expression that was direct and unguarded, in a way I had not expected from a Cathari official. "These figures, the relay network, are these verified?" "Independently verified by 3 separate audit teams over the past 14 months, I said. 83.4%, she said quietly, as if confirming something she was still making herself believe. "For 38 years, I said. The current degradation in 4 sectors is a direct consequence of our technical teams having departed. There is no equipment failure, The equipment is performing exactly as designed. It simply requires human oversight to function at capacity, and that oversight is no longer present. She looked back down at the document and said nothing more for a long time. We broke after 4 hours of initial review and limited discussion, and I had not intended to go further on the first day. What I had intended was exactly what happened. The delegation taking the document back to their ships, reading it again in the privacy of their own quarters, and sitting with what it meant. In my private log that evening, I wrote something I had not planned to write. I wrote, "The strange thing about being finally seen is that it does not feel the way you imagined it would. It does not feel like relief. It feels like the moment after a very long effort, when the effort stops and the body does not quite know what to do with the absence of strain." On the second day, the Accord delegation presented their own proposal. It was, compared to anything they had offered in the previous 31 cycles, dramatically better. Expanded consultative roles, increased human representation across subsidiary committees, a formal acknowledgement of human contributions in the Accord's written historical record. For a moment, sitting across the table from Theron as he walked through the proposal, I felt the particular pull of that improvement, the way that something much better than what you have always been given can feel, briefly, like enough. It was not enough. A consultative role is not a seat, I said. An acknowledgement in a historical document does not affect decisions being made today. These proposals represent genuine progress from what we have been offered before. They are not sufficient. Theron leaned forward slightly. Ambassador Voss, I understand your position, but we are working within political constraints. There are species in the Accord who will resist expanded human representation at the council level. The internal dynamics are complex. I have spent 11 years navigating those internal dynamics from the outside, I said. I understand them precisely. I understand that some species in this Accord are afraid of what a full human voice at the table might say. I understand that the politics of recognition are difficult for people who have held certain arrangements for a long time. I held his gaze steadily. But the last time political complexity was offered to us as a reason to wait, we waited another cycle. And then another. The complexity never resolved itself. It was managed, and managing it required our invisible participation in holding the system together, and we did that without complaint, for 60 years, and it still was not enough to earn us what we were asking for. The room was quiet. We are not here to damage the Accord, I said. We are here because the Accord needs to become something it has not yet been, which is genuinely equitable, not in language, in structure. The difference between those two things is what the ledger describes. On the third day, Director General Nwosu joined the session by secure link from Lagos and spoke for 40 minutes without notes, and she said things I had not been able to say because I was too close to them in the way that proximity sometimes obscures the full shape of something. She spoke about what it costs a civilization to spend 60 years placing its best and most capable people in service to a system that will not give those people a real voice in return. She spoke about the specific, human cost of that arrangement, not in abstract terms but in precise ones. The engineers who built relay nodes in deep space and were never named in any official record, the mediators who kept border tensions from becoming conflicts and whose work was attributed to natural de-escalation, the medical teams whose tools saved lives and whose contracts were never publicly acknowledged. She spoke about what it does to a generation of people to be told, repeatedly and across decades, that their work is valuable, but their voice is not ready. She said that the Earth Cooperative had not withdrawn from the Accord because it wished to see the Accord fail. It had withdrawn because the alternative was raising another generation of brilliant, capable humans in service to a system that treated their participation as utility and their personhood as a condition to be evaluated, rather than a reality to be respected. When she finished, the room held a silence that was different from the silences that had come before it. And then Voss Marine said something I had not prepared for. She said, I owe you an apology. Not on behalf of the Accord, as an institution, personally to you, Ambassador Voss. She paused, and her tone carried a weight that Cathari formality does not usually permit outside the most serious circumstances. My uncle was in the chamber on the day of the most recent vote. I watched the session recording afterward. His conduct was not consistent with the best of what our species values in formal settings. I am sorry that it occurred. I looked at her for a moment. A direct personal apology from a Cathari, in a formal diplomatic context, was not a small thing. It cost something. That was clear from how she held herself while she said it. "Thank you," I said. "I accept it." She nodded once, and returned to the documents in front of her. On the fourth morning, I arrived in the chamber 40 minutes before the delegation did. I sat at our side of the table alone, and read through the notes from the previous day, and thought about what the 5th and 6th and 7th days would need to produce, and about what kind of agreement, specifically, would be worth the cost of everything that had been paid to reach it. The new accord's core requirement was not symbolic. That was the thing I kept returning to in every quiet moment between sessions. Symbolic recognition was what they had been prepared to offer in cycle after cycle. Words in records and titles on documents and formal language that would not change who sat in which chair when it mattered. What we required was structural. Structural meant that even when the political will weakened, as it always did, as it did in every system that had ever existed, the structure itself would enforce what the goodwill alone would not. The accountability mechanisms had been the hardest negotiated point. Not the seats, not the recognition language, the mechanisms. Because those were what would make the seats mean something in 10 years, in 20, when the people in this room were retired, and the people who came after them had less memory of the crisis and more capacity for comfortable habits to slowly reassert themselves. The mechanisms were the guarantee that this was not another 30-year cycle waiting to happen. Thuran had understood this quickly. He had pushed back on the specificity of the enforcement language on day 2, and then on day 3 he had stopped pushing, and I had watched him make that decision in real time and understood that he had grasped something that mattered. We were not going to accept language that felt secure but was not. Voss Marine had grasped it even faster. She had spent most of day 3 asking detailed questions about the accountability review processes, not in the manner of someone looking for weaknesses, but in the manner of someone who wanted to understand a mechanism well enough to argue for it to their own government. I was thinking about all of this when the first delegates began arriving for day 4. Oliver Grant arrived in Cape Town on the morning of the 4th day of negotiations. I had called him the previous evening, after the 3rd day had ended with real movement on the medical infrastructure terms. I had explained the Sethan situation in full, the nature of the parameter issue, what Oliver's involvement would require. He had not let me finish before he said he would be on the first available transport. He was a quiet man in his mid-50s, with the economical manner of someone who spent most of his working life thinking about problems rather than talking about them. He sat down with the Sethan health official in a side room adjacent to the main chamber, and worked with him for 2 full days, and by the time he packed up his materials to return to Edinburgh, he had provided the technical adjustment that the Sethan teams needed to correctly model the outbreak's behavior. He did not ask to be part of the negotiations. He did not want a seat at the table, or a line in any agreement, or any acknowledgement in the public record of what had happened. He had been asked for help, and he had come, and he had done the work, and then he left. That was Oliver. That had always been Oliver. I shook his hand when he was leaving, and he shook mine firmly and said, "Good luck in there," and then he was gone. I stood in the corridor for a moment, then I went back to the negotiating chamber, and the 17 points, and the long work of building something new. The signing of the new accord took place on a morning when Cape Town had decided to demonstrate exactly what Southern Hemisphere autumn could be at its finest. Clear, cool, a wind coming in off the ocean that was strong enough to snap every ceremonial flag on the exterior of the facility into a continuous, energetic motion, as if the building itself was trying to communicate something. I had not slept particularly well the night before, not from anxiety, from a kind of restlessness that I have come to recognize in myself as the specific feeling of a large thing being very close to final, and the mind insisting on reviewing everything one last time to be certain. I had gone through the document again from beginning to end. I had checked the specific clauses that mattered most, the High Council seats, the infrastructure co-ownership framework, the retroactive contribution recognition, the accountability mechanisms that would ensure the agreement had teeth and not merely language. Every time I checked them, they were still there, exactly as negotiated. I read the whole thing twice, and then I went back to sleep for 3 more hours, which was the most sensible thing I did that entire week. Callum had left breakfast outside my door, and a note that said the final pre-signing briefing was in 90 minutes, and that the delegation's ships had confirmed ceremonial protocol. He had also, without comment, hung my dark blue formal jacket on the back of the door. I had bought that jacket 11 years ago before my first session in the Hall of Accord, because I had believed, at the time, that I would need it for the vote that would finally go our way. I had believed that for many years, longer perhaps than was strictly rational. The jacket still fit. The signing chamber was the largest room in the Cape Town facility, a long, high-ceilinged hall where the natural light came in well, through wide south-facing windows, the bay visible in the distance as a line of silver between the land and the horizon. 17 Accord species were represented in that room. Director General Nwosu sat at the head of the Earth Cooperative's side of the formal table, and she was wearing a suit the color of deep water, and her close-cut gray hair, and her expression of someone who had been working toward this moment for 4 decades, without ever allowing the length of the wait to make her doubt that it would arrive. Ambassador Thuran sat directly across from her. Beside him were Voss Marine and the other delegation leads, and a room full of people who had, between them, flown across multiple star systems to be present for what was happening today. I sat to Nwosu's right. The full text of the new accord was read aloud in 3 languages: English, or informal register, and the common trade dialect that served as the accord's functional shared tongue. The reading took 40 minutes. I had read the document so many times that I could follow along by sound alone, and I spent the time looking at the people in the room instead, fixing the faces, the postures, the particular quality of attention that this moment was producing in people who had come here, representing very different interests, and were all, nonetheless, present. The Sethan health official was in the observers' gallery. His name was Davin Orr, and he had been working with Accord medical teams for 20 years, and when he had sat across from Oliver in the side room for 2 days working through the containment software together, he had barely slept, had barely eaten, had worked with the focused intensity of someone for whom the numbers on the screen represented people he knew personally. The outbreak on his homeworld had been brought under control 11 days ago. The mortality rate had been significantly lower than the initial model had projected, because once the parameter adjustment was made, the Sethan medical teams had responded with a discipline and efficiency that had been present all along, waiting for the right information. Davin Orr caught my eye once across the chamber and gave a single small nod. I returned it. Stuart Adeyemi was also in the observers' gallery. I had invited him personally, and he had accepted without asking why, which suggested he already knew. He sat in the 3rd row in a gray suit with the alert stillness of someone who understands that what is happening around them has consequence beyond what can be seen in the immediate moment. 40,000 successful dockings without a single incident, across 9 years at a node that had now been in the news across the Accord for weeks. Not one of those dockings had been in any official record with his name attached to it. That was about to change, in the specific way that things change when the framework that made the invisibility possible is restructured from its foundations. Harriet Cole was not there in person. She was at her post near the Velun Rim, because the monitoring work continued and Harriet was, as she had always been, committed to being where the work was. She had sent me a message the evening before that read, "Make it count. I will be watching the feeds." I had replied, "Keep the records." She had responded with a single character that I had chosen to interpret as enthusiastic agreement. When the reading was complete, Director General Nwosu picked up the signing instrument. She moved with the precision and economy that defined everything she did. No hesitation, no performative pause, just a clear and deliberate act, and then she passed the instrument to me, and I signed, and we sent it across the table to Thuran. It moved through the delegation in order of formal precedence. The room held its breath in the particular way that rooms hold their breath when they are aware that a moment is becoming permanent. When the last signature was placed, the Accord Protocol Officer announced the signing complete, and the observers' gallery responded and the delegates at the table moved, and the moment became its own particular kind of noise, voices and the sound of chairs, and the specific quality of a large space adjusting to what had just happened inside it. Thuran crossed to me before the formal reception began. He carried himself with the measured dignity of the Orin, which I had spent years learning to read as care rather than coldness, a way of moving through important moments without allowing feeling to make those moments less than they deserve to be. He stopped in front of me and looked at me directly. "Ambassador Voss," he said, "I want to offer you a personal word, separate from the formal proceedings." "Of course," I said. "When I sent you that message, on day 83 of your withdrawal," he said, "I genuinely believed I was extending an offer of support. I understand now that I was not asking the right question. I was asking whether you needed help. The question I should have been asking was why the help had always originated with you, and why that had never been formally credited, and what the absence of that formal credit had meant across 60 years. He paused. "I am sorry that I did not ask those questions earlier. I am sorry that it required this degree of disruption for me to understand them clearly." I looked at him for a moment. Theron had been one of the few people in the Accord who had occasionally treated me as a genuine peer rather than a useful presence. And even he had not fully seen it until now. That was its own kind of information about how completely the assumption had been embedded in the system. "Thank you, Theron," I said. "I believe you mean it." "With that level of disruption as a teaching tool," he said, with the dry precision that I had come to recognize as the Orin's closest approach to humor, "it would be difficult not to." "We prefer to call it a restructuring," I said. "Naturally," he said. The reception was held on the terrace overlooking the bay. The autumn afternoon had softened from the morning's sharp clarity into something warmer, the wind quieter, the light on the water going from silver to the particular gold that happens at southern latitudes in the late afternoon, a color you cannot quite name but that you recognize immediately when you are standing in it. Voss Marine found me at the terrace railing, looking at the water, and came to stand beside me without speaking, which I had learned was a Cathari way of asking permission to share a space. I let the silence stand for a moment, and then she spoke. "It was page 7, she said, "of the ledger. That was where I stopped the first time I read it." "I know," I said. "The border mediation section. The Kareth Duvani corridor." She was quiet for a moment. "My family has a settlement near that border. I grew up hearing that it was a stable region, that it had always been stable, that there was no particular reason to worry about it." She looked at the water. "I never knew why it was stable. I never asked. Nobody I grew up with asked. Page 7 told me why." I did not offer her anything in return. Sometimes the right response to someone arriving at understanding is simply to let them stand in it. "It will not happen again," she said. The tone carried something more specific than a general commitment, something personal. "The invisibility. From where I sit, it will not be reproduced. I am stating that to you directly, not as a formal Accord position, but as my own." I thought about Oliver in his Edinburgh office, spending 18 years building tools for people he would never meet. I thought about Harriet at her observation post, filing careful reports that nobody in the Accord had known existed until they became relevant to a crisis. I thought about Stuart, counting dockings by the thousands, every one successful, none of them in any record bearing his name. "The structural guarantees in the new Accord matter," I said. "But yes, individual commitment matters alongside them. You are right about that." She nodded and moved back toward the other delegates. I stayed at the railing. Director General Nwosu came and stood beside me a few minutes later. She was holding a glass of water, which was her invariable choice at formal events, because she did not like any softening of attention, when attention was what a situation required. "How do you feel?" she asked, the same question she had asked me when I came home, and when I arrived at Cape Town, and now here, a thread running through the whole arc of it. "Careful," I said. "This is not an ending. It is a beginning of something considerably more complex." "The Mirathi delegation spoke to me before the signing," she said. "They want a conversation about their contributions to Accord communication infrastructure, the ones that have never been formally recognized." "I expected that," I said. The young Thon representative came to me as well. Similar subject. I looked at the water turning gold in the late light. Other species, other ledgers, other years of invisible maintenance waiting to be seen. "The table is going to be very full," I said. "Yes," she said. "Is that a problem?" I thought about it honestly. It would be complicated. It would be loud and difficult, and there would be sessions that ran for days without resolution, and there would be competing interests, and genuine disagreements, and moments when the complexity felt like it was outpacing the capacity to manage it. That was what a genuinely equitable table produced, and it was the right kind of difficulty. the kind that came from taking everyone's presence seriously instead of managing it from the outside. No, I said. A full table is the point. It has always been the point. She looked out at the bay. The Sethan outbreak is fully contained as of this morning. Final report confirmed an hour ago. I let out a slow breath. I had carried that alongside everything else for weeks, the weight of knowing that people were sick, and that the absence of a software parameter adjustment was making it worse. It had not stopped being heavy just because the decision to wait had been the right one. Oliver did good work, I said. Oliver always did good work, she said, for 18 years. We stood there for a while, the two of us, while the reception continued behind us, and the southern autumn came in off the water, and the day moved toward evening, in the way that days do, when they have been full of something that will matter for a long time. 3 weeks after the signing, I returned to Velun Prime. Not to petition. Not carrying anyone's badge on behalf of a people who had been told to wait. I was there as a High Council member, one of 3 humans now holding permanent seats in the chamber that had seen 32 cycles of rejected petitions eventually resolve into something that looked, at last, like the truth of what the relationship had always been. The Hall of Accord looked exactly the same from the outside. The towers were still the same beautiful old stone. The founding charter was still etched in 60 languages along the upper walls, none of them human. That would change in the next administrative cycle, one of the specific commitments in the new accord, the formal addition of 4 human languages to the official founding document. The correction would take place without ceremony, which was appropriate, because the absence had not been ceremonial. I had not come back to see the building or to stand beneath the charter and feel something about the languages. I had come back to walk the corridor. The long, pale, blue-lit corridor outside the main chamber, the one I had walked on the day I left, where my footsteps had been the only sound and the Oran delegates had pretended not to watch me pass. I walked it again. No aid, no delegation, no purpose other than to walk it and know the difference between this time and the last. At the far end, near the wall, there was a bench I had never noticed in 11 years of passing through that corridor. It sat in a small alcove that I had always walked past too quickly to see. I sat down on it. I sat there for about 10 minutes. I thought about Lena Marsh, who had carried the same translation badge for 14 years before me, who had retired to a house somewhere in the Scottish countryside, who had sent me 2 sentences when she heard about the new accord. The first was congratulations. The second was, they took their time, which was true, and which also managed to be both generous and precise simultaneously, which was very much her way. I thought about Paul Okafor before Lena, 9 years of his life given to the same work in the same building, his name in no official record except the internal ones we kept ourselves. I thought about the first humans who had joined the Accord, 60 years ago, who had shown up with their engineering knowledge and their conflict mediation skills and their willingness to do whatever needed doing, and who had probably believed, as each subsequent generation had believed, that the value they provided would eventually translate into recognition. It had taken 60 years and 180 days of careful, deliberate, principled withdrawal, and a pile of evidence that filled a document we called the Ledger, and a presentation from a woman in Lagos who made the complexity of the cost simple and clear enough to reach people who had been choosing not to see it. It had taken all of that. But it had arrived. I stood up and straightened my jacket and walked back down the corridor, my footsteps the same sound they had always made on that stone floor, and pushed through the main doors and down the wide stone steps and into the diplomatic quarter where Callum was waiting with a transport and coffee, and the briefing for tomorrow's first full session. "Ready?" he asked. I got in. I took the coffee. I looked at the briefing summary. The agenda had 17 items. The Karath Duvani Border Resolution Framework was 3rd. The Relay Network Full Restoration Plan was 4th. A new item from the Mirathi delegation, requesting formal recognition of their communication infrastructure contributions, was 11th, added just 2 days ago. A Thon proposal regarding Deep Space Survey credit attribution was 15th. The table was full. "Let's begin," I said. The transport moved out through the diplomatic quarter of Velun Prime. Above us, the Hall of Accord stood exactly as it had always stood, old and enormous, and certain of its own permanence. But permanence is not something you inherit. It is something you maintain. And the people who had always maintained it had finally, after 60 years of doing so without acknowledgement, taken their place at the table where permanence was decided. The transport turned a corner, and the hall disappeared behind the old stone buildings of the quarter, and the city spread out ahead of us, pale and quiet under its green translucent sky, old and beautiful, and, for the first time in a very long time, moving towards something genuinely new. I opened the briefing materials and got to work.
Low-key good that you fought him right there, because there's a dude wide open left corner. Charging. What? He missed board. We out. I got to bounce back. I got to bounce back right there. I shouldn't even went up with it. Why would I go up with that?